Good morning, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on enhancing the role of recently mandated advisory boards. Before we go ahead and get started this morning, I'm going to review a few basic instructions for our audience. First of all, please be aware that all participant lines will be muted for the entire presentation in order to reduce noise and any distractions heard on your line. At the end of the presentation, we will allow time for questions and answers. If you have a question you would like addressed, you may type it in and we will read it out for you. To do that, you simply click on the Q&A button on the menu bar at the top of your screen. You can type and then submit your question, and we will do our best to make sure that it is answered. Also, just for everyone to know, we will be sending a copy of these slides to all our participants, as well as a report of the summary of the survey, which will also be available online that you can download from the Knowledge Center, which is on our website. That all being said, I'm happy to introduce our faculty for today's webinar. We have Jim Rice, Executive Vice President, and Kate Brecky, Consultant, both with our governance, leadership, and executive compensation practice. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Jim.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. We want to first begin by thanking you and expressing our appreciation for all that you are doing to champion the enhanced effectiveness of organ procurement and transplantation across the United States. We very much understand and appreciate the role that you're playing to save and enhance lives. One of the recent developments that you have been wrestling with are the pressure from CMS to develop effective clinical advisory boards. This next few minutes is to share with you what we have been finding in interviews with you and a national survey about both the obstacles that many of you have been experiencing in establishing and gaining effective input from these clinical advisory boards, as well as some new insights that might help strengthen and enhance their effectiveness to you. As you will notice on slide 3, we believe that from our studies over the last year, these advisory boards are an underused resource for 3 important areas. The enhanced rapport that you have been building over the years with their transplant centers, developing deeper insights into the science of transplant medicine that can be shared with your staff and your fiduciary governing boards, and also broader engagement of both public and clinician stakeholders that are engaged with the organ procurement organizations' challenge of both organ and tissue donation, but increasingly we're finding funding donations as well. We have on slide 4 identified for you some of the issues that have been sparked by CMS as they have encouraged you to develop these advisory bodies. We see an increase in the need for uniformity across and among organ procurement organizations. This sharing of ideas about how you will relate to the advisory boards is something this small webinar is designed to try and encourage and facilitate. There's increasing attempt to raise the bar on the effectiveness and the performance of all organ procurement organizations through the benefit and the value of a more sharply focused advisory body. We also know that the advisory boards are not generating yet as much value as they can, and we'll be making comments about the structure and effectiveness of their roles. Also, all of you have been finding and experimenting and exploring some new strategies, some of which we will be able to summarize and share across the country in this short webinar and in the downloadable materials that you can get following this webinar. We're going to be examining some new strategies for effectiveness and flexibility in the use of the advisory boards, and therefore you'll see on slide 6 that our time with you today is focused around conclusions we've reached in these 3 general areas. We're going to share with you through the work of Kate Brecky summarizing the insights gained from two major surveys that we've conducted during the past year. We'll be looking at some identified obstacles that are frustrating you on the use of these advisory bodies, and we're going to, very importantly, share with you a list of strategies that we believe are demonstrating good value and enhanced results from these advisory bodies, and some new strategies that we think will bear positive value and fruit for your efforts in the coming 18 months. Let's invite Kate Brecky to join with us now as we start looking at some of the early conclusions from the national surveys. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Jim. As Jim mentioned, over the next few slides, I'm going to discuss results from two surveys that we conducted during the year 2009. They were national in scope and were directed at leaders and board members in the industry. And by way of background, we asked questions related first to basic board structure of new advisory boards. And the first question we asked then related to actual advisory board size. And the response we got was that 14 to 17 members was the most common number of board members to include on advisory boards. 44% of respondents indicated this. 21% indicated that they have 18 to 21 members, and then 18% indicated that they have 10 to 13 members. And also by way of background, we asked the board meeting frequency for these newly established groups and found that 85% of the respondents have quarterly meetings and 12% have 3 or fewer meetings a year. And then the remaining percent, which I didn't indicate on here, had just 1 meeting a year.
That's a good insight into the structure, Kate, and I know you also gathered information about the competencies and backgrounds of these leaders. Can you share again some of the insights we've found from those surveys?
Yes, we also wanted to ask respondents to rate the importance of various potential board members. As organizations struggle with the formation of their boards, we thought this was also a relevant question. And 88% of the respondents felt that it was important or very important to include transplant surgeons on their new advisory boards. 81% felt that ER representatives from a hospital in the service area was important or very important. And 78% felt both hospital administrators and organ donor family members were important or very important to include. And then also neurosurgeons, physicians with knowledge in the field of neurology, physicians with PhDs, or physicians or PhDs with histocompatibility or biological science background. Representatives from the public and representatives from tissue bank were also, by respondents, deemed very important or important to include on advisory boards. Many boards are struggling with what to include on their agendas and determining what their advisory board should be focusing on. And so on the next slide, I cover what we asked them in relation to how they felt about some of the areas of input in which their advisory members could provide and how important those areas would be to them. For example, optimizing the procurement of organizations and tissues from donors by 88% of the respondents was deemed important or very important. 71% believed that the annual evaluation of effectiveness and acquisition of organs was important or very important to get input on from their advisory board members. Establishing medical management protocols for donors, 68%. Also 68% for enhancing quality standards for the acquisition and preservation of organs was deemed important or very important from respondents. And then coordinating activities with transplant hospitals, 59%. Further developing efforts to reach potential donors at 56%. And then there were also some areas that were mentioned, which included developing evidence-based donor management. This was in kind of the write-in section that we included on the survey, a predominant theme, and quality assurance, and also evaluating laboratory services for donor testing came up quite often.
It's clear, Kate, that in this early year or two that the industry is developing these, that there's an obvious focus on the clinical value and insights they can share back to the fiduciary boards. And I know also that in some of our interviews of these folks that they are finding that even though you invite the talent into the advisory boards and they're to be focused on these clinical areas, sometimes it's still not yet working as well as everybody would like. And also some of the advisory board members we've been talking with are identifying information that would help them feel more confident and confident about their advisory roles. Maybe you can share with us some of the areas that they would like to know more about.
Sure, and we approached this topic using open-ended questions with our respondents, and we wanted to learn what areas in managing their advisory boards OPOs are struggling with. You'll probably identify with a number of these. It helps to know what others are dealing with in a similar situation, and also it helps to know in general what other areas other OPOs are struggling with. So some of the common themes we found included specific responsibilities and activities of high-performing advisory boards. Other advisory boards also wanted to learn more about the type of information presented at advisory board meetings, the types of strategies for recruiting talented members for the board, and also, this one was quite predominant too, the dashboards being used. Strategies for keeping members engaged and participating came up often, cultivating and maintaining public involvement, and establishing optimal board composition also came up often.
In response to these areas that folks across the country identified as being areas in which they'd like to have more information, it has stimulated us to provide this webinar, and we'll guide some of our presentation of suggestions on how to make some of that information available later in the webinar. I know also that you have explored the obstacles to effective use of these advisory boards. Kate, maybe you can summarize some of the issues that have been identified in our work thus far.
You know, there's it's quite extensive list, and they're all very extensive and need to be dealt with, but I think for purposes of time we'll just go into a few of them and highlight those that we found over and over again. One of them was the lack of understanding the role of the advisory board. In many cases, powers and functions haven't been clearly communicated. Appropriate work hasn't been channeled to the advisory board, whether it's related to medical issues or public awareness issues. Necessary medical questions being raised by the governing board. This isn't always happening, and there's some concern with advisory boards that the governing boards aren't sure what medical questions to even be raising. An overlap in already existing well-functioning advisory boards is an obstacle that's come up. Many organizations already had well-functioning advisory boards and are having this mandate only really muddying the waters for them. And in the next slides, or in the next section, we get to respond to how some of our clients are dealing with these sort of muddied waters of having some overlap in the types of advisory boards in their organizations. Looking further down on slide 13, poor coordination and communication with governing boards is also an obstacle. Many organizations haven't set up channels for communicating between the boards, whether it's sharing agendas, attending each other's meetings. These are some of the solutions, and we get into many more of these solutions on the next slide.
Thank you, Kate. One of the things that we concluded from the survey is that while many of these obstacles may be a function of the advisory bodies being relatively new, many of you have only had them in place under the new CMS regulatory constraint over the last year or so. Nevertheless, we do know that these are obstacles that you are identifying and wrestling with, and so we're going to leave slide 13 in front of you just for a moment as we go through some of the early insights of how we would suggest you deal with a number of these potential obstacles on slide 13, and then later in the webinar we'll give you additional suggestions as well. If you look at the first couple of points on the top of slide 13, you will see a common refrain is the lack of understanding about the role of the advisory board. Even though the statutes and the regulations from the federal government outline the basic charge for the advisory board, we're finding it important for you to reissue that charge as an opportunity for board member orientation and a part of the recruitment activity, but to link with that a couple of other documents that should be reviewed and initialed each year. One is a job description for each member that's invited onto the advisory board so they clearly understand their individual roles and responsibilities and the expectations of how they can contribute their wisdom to the benefit of the OPO's mission and activities. A second document that should be reviewed and initialed each year is a disclosure statement, and related to that, a conflict of interest statement. Most of you have developed these, but we find it would be helpful if you have those three documents together, where they're reviewed and initialed near the end of your fiscal year as you step into the new year. The job description, a disclosure statement, and a conflict of interest statement to make sure everybody clearly understands their role and how much they can and can't do compared to the overall OPO fiduciary board. If you go to the middle of the points that are mentioned on slide 13, identifying useful work, the lack of strategic focus, losing sight of the agenda and work plan, we are suggesting that joint strategic visioning and planning sessions can be developed between your fiduciary board and these advisory boards. There should be one structured meeting a year where everybody not only has an opportunity to be reminded about their relative roles and contributions, but to look into the future and to have some conversations that shape and drive a 3-year plan of action for the OPO main board and a 3-year plan of action for the clinical advisory board. It's also useful for the senior staff and the board chairs of the advisory boards to invite more full engagement from other board members about the agendas to be used for the meetings and for the priorities for the upcoming annual work plan. We're finding still too many of these advisory boards that are drifting into their year without a clear work plan that ties back to their mission and to their charge. The last comment that we would share with you as it relates to organizing the work around substantive issues, as Kate has mentioned, many of those need to be around the clinical and the scientific and the medical elements of transplantation and of organs as well as tissues, but the communications can be much sharper and more effectively focused if you have an opportunity for these board members to identify potential issues and obstacles to their success and to build agenda items and communication opportunities around those challenges and those opportunities. The last area that Kate mentioned as we get ready to transition to the next slide was the coordination and communication. We've identified a number of strategies for you to consider in that regard. Those will become evident as we start looking at ways to enhance the effectiveness of your advisory boards. Kate, let's look at a strategic or conceptual framework by the boxes and flow of responsibilities shown on slide 15.
Yes, we thought this slide did a good job of laying out many of the pieces we think advisory boards need to put in place to overcome their obstacles. And we've kind of broken them out in the slides following into strategic categories. And Jim and I will both be covering some of those. The first category that I'm going to talk about, which we refer to as leveraging time and talent. And again, we've grouped these into 5 different areas of strategic imperatives. But the first one, leveraging time and talent, and looking at the first bullet point, One of the best ways we're seeing our clients utilizing that advisory board is by vetting unique issues that the governing board needs assistance with. And we've talked about this in the obstacles section previously. Again, it's a great way to utilize your advisory board.
This is what you mentioned before, Kate, in terms of medical challenges, clinical issues related to securing organs or tissues, and then, of course, the changing science of the transplantation process itself. I think one of the goals that the CMS had in organizing the clinical expertise into the advisory boards is to make sure that wisdom gets transmitted over to the fiduciary board. So I think it's wise for you to keep shining that spotlight on that issue.
Right, and it's really a joint effort by both boards and any subcommittees that you form in order to establish this communication on these issues between the two. It may be at times that your medical or your clinical groups are coming up with issues that should be brought to the governing board, and it may be that the governing board is shooting issues down to your advisory boards and your clinical committees. But really they do need to be working together to solve these medical issues. So drilling down farther, obviously boards or subcommittees who report back to the advisory board should be utilizing available reports. I'm looking at the second bullet. To identify challenges and deliberate upon these. So reports such as your utilization of clinical case reviews, unproductive after consent, and organs not recovered reports. We've also identified on leveraging time and talent, putting in place enhanced orientation programs. A lot of groups have some preliminary work done around this area, but it's these efforts that get your members up to speed. It can be from basic areas such as reviewing agendas prior to the board meetings and coming prepared. Such basic information as that some members who don't have experience are not aware of. And this orientation program should include a handbook, and we're even seeing some clients include a DVD as a sort of supplement to that handbook or manual that's provided. So there's many creative ways to approach this orientation program, but it is a critical piece in getting your board up to speed and really being effective members of the board.
Kate, before you move on, you mentioned the DVD, and that reminds us that later in this webinar we will be commenting about the desirability and the value of having a board portal. The digital age is certainly upon us, and there can be, it's quite easy now to have short streaming video clips where either scientists or clinicians or other board members can have 30 and 45-second clips helping new board members get oriented to both clinical as well as policy and political issues regarding their advisory role and the role of the main OPO fiduciary board. So this board portal we'll come back to later, but I like this idea that we're starting to see some of these groups harness the digital age for better management of knowledge to improve their effectiveness.
Yes, it's an important piece for OPOs to really start considering and honing in on. The second to last bullet, developing strong subcommittees and work group structures. I've alluded to these committees, subcommittees quite often throughout the presentation. And it's really important for organizations to create their advisory boards and structures that make the most sense in getting work done. So that may be committees, subcommittees, different groups within your advisory board, in which, in the case of your subcommittees or committees related to medical issues, they would focus strictly on medical discussions that can be addressed and solved. And be strategic in who you put on your committees. Match the strengths of your members with the issues that your organization is dealing with.
I know also, as you mentioned before, so many of the seats in these advisory boards are being filled by clinicians. They do not suffer meetings nor process very well, and there is a move across the country we're seeing for the transplant surgeons that have a particular focus on an organ to want to talk with colleagues about those unique organ issues or tissue issues. And I know that this is being used as a way to organize the focus of some of these committees around clinical or organ systems to look at challenges and opportunities to improve their processes. So that, I think, makes good sense, and your acknowledgement and encouragement for these leaders to focus on that is important.
Thanks. The last bullet, just to touch on quickly too, maintain focus on areas of optimizing procurement, transplant outcomes, and misallocation of organs. It's important to keep a proper focus in order to leverage the time and talent of your advisory board members. And Jim, on slide 17, I'm going to skip down to the last bullet. This is something I know that you work with a lot with our previous engagements in conducting board self-assessment, so I'm going to let you run away with this one.
Yes, this is advice and counsel we would share not just with the OPO's clinical advisory body, but also the main fiduciary board. We would encourage you every year to do a short analysis of how well do you think the board is performing against your purpose, your mission, your charge. The 12 key responsibilities that have been pushed onto these advisory boards by the CMS, it is a useful framework for the self-assessment to be framed and focused around those 12. Most organizations that are starting to develop an annual self-assessment will find it helpful to develop a simple 5 or 7 point Likert scale to identify the degree to which they think they are doing well on these responsibilities, with some open-ended opportunity to provide 1 or 2 actions that they believe would be helpful in the coming year to improve the effectiveness of the advisory board in each of those key 12 areas. Let's move now to the second of the 5 strategic areas for enhancing the effectiveness of these areas. Kate, what else are you finding?
So I'm looking at slide 18. Another strategic imperative that we came up with was developing advisory board and governing board relations. And this is critical in helping both boards get done what they need to get done. Some suggestions include providing minutes, meetings, summaries to the alternative board, so your governing board providing their minutes and meetings to the advisory board and vice versa, providing education and orientation on the respective board's responsibilities and duties, and plan for a joint meeting once a year. Jim, I know this is another topic that you're going to discuss further in a couple slides out from here, which is a very important one. Including members from each board to periodically attend the other board's meetings, or consistently include advisory board and governing board meetings, and this would be by invitation and in an advisory capacity only. But this would even further close the communication gap that often exists between the advisory board and the governing board.
I think those make sense, Kate, and I would call our audience participants' attention to the second point there on slide 18. These education and orientation efforts, we are finding that this can be done jointly. If you're going to bring in outside speakers, you may be able to schedule it successfully so that relatively new board members for the fiduciary board as well as the advisory board could come together for some of those joint education activities. We're moving now then, Kate, to strategic imperative 3, the use of their time in meetings, meeting effectiveness. What are we finding there?
Some suggestions we have around this area is, 1, making membership as inclusive as possible, and also think in terms of diversity when you're establishing your members. Using data to drive decision and activities, so review outcomes and be open to research to enhance clinical practice. Providing agenda and notes in advance of scheduled meetings, we've talked about this before as an issue. Keep agendas relevant to areas of responsibility and inclusive of meaningful issues that require input and advice, and this will keep your participants, your board members, engaged. Invite guest speakers for educational opportunities. Jim also just mentioned the benefits of doing that. Establish strong communication between boards and committees. Invite your governance board chair to present on their relevant issues. Again, to help your advisory board understand just what the governance board's focusing on, and develop the communication between the two. And the last one, keep public awareness as a standard agenda item.
I'd like to see that item Kate, because although the vast majority of the work and the discussions of these clinical advisory boards will focus on the medicine and the science of the transplantation process, it's a real opportunity to make sure that the whole area of public awareness and encouragement for donating organs and tissue is going to continue to be a challenge, and the advisory board can make meaningful contributions in that, as you've indicated. Let's go to the fourth of 5 areas, looking at the use of technology.
Yes, the last one we've recognized is utilization of technology, and this is also key in developing your advisory boards. It works in keeping them cohesive in their work as well as engaged and focused. For example, web portals. These should be used as a vehicle really for disseminating the information that we've talked about periodically throughout the presentation already, such as minutes and meeting synopsis. Also, your work plan calendars is a good piece to include in the web portal. Bylaws, charges, Jim talked about some of those. Medical protocols even are a good idea and are of often benefit to board members to be able to reference. Powers and functions, another item Jim mentioned in passing. And then agendas, of course. Again, having a place that's easy for your board members to locate the information that they need. It keeps them, again, as I said, engaged and more cohesive. We've also identified live meetings and online conferencing. A lot of our board members have indicated that this allows a higher number of participation levels in meetings, as it's easier for them to obviously dial in or attend a live meeting rather than, in many cases, they're flying or driving for these board meetings. So that's another important one for organizations to continue focusing on. And then in general, electronic communications. Many of our board members don't want paper. You know, they want to be sent their agendas, the meetings, work plan calendars, etc., anything that's being sent to them via the internet. So there's a strong interest by our clients for even more use of technology with and for their boards.
It makes sense, Kate, and I know particularly when the advisory boards are only meeting 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, this electronic thread of information can keep them informed and engaged throughout the year, and also, of course, take greater advantage of the quality of interaction and discussion when they do come together, hopefully face-to-face as much as possible. This is going to be a useful tool going forward. On slide 21, we have the 5th of our 5 strategic imperatives. This is a mix of ideas and strategies that have been identified as providing real potential to strengthen the operational success of the OPO by having a mix of clinical and stakeholder participants on these advisory boards. You improve the probability of being able to accomplish and to deliver some of the points that we would like to summarize for you on slides 21 and 22. Kate, I'll run through some of these very briefly and then give you a chance to react as necessary. We do want to make sure our participants are aware that we will be inviting questions from them in just a few moments. This webinar is a part of a series of interactions and studies that we will be doing throughout all of 2010, all designed to strengthen the operational success of organ procurement organizations. On slide 21, we have mentioned again the use of strong subcommittees. And we want to come back and tease out just a bit further some of the examples that you have been sharing with us across the country. One of the areas that we've not focused on much yet in this webinar is the balance between organ procurement and tissue procurement. Many of you are identifying both as a source of need and also a source of revenue that a stronger and more enhanced role in the tissue procurement and harnessing that talent necessary for tissue transplantation will likely be an important element and focus of these advisory boards in the coming 2 to 3 years. And so we are seeing already subcommittees that are framed not just on kidney and specific organ procurement, but this new and exciting area of tissue as well. The second point there that we would encourage some increased discussion about is the whole arena of building education that is far-reaching, strategic of insight and nature. For example, advisory boards could convene either a spring summit or a fall summit that invites in speakers from within the region and from outside the region to look at trends in the science of transplantation, both of organs and of tissues, to look at the growing economic dynamics of revenues and expense for that important role going forward. And the advisory board can be a very important resource to take the lead to champion that kind of region-wide education. Also, it doesn't have to be just education and orientation for the advisory board members and the board members of the OPO itself, but it's an opportunity to rekindle and to strengthen working relationships with your transplant centers by convening or being a champion to have conducted 1 or 2 educational conferences on the science and the art and the economics of the transplantation process, where nurses and physicians from throughout the region are invited in. Increasingly, we may see what we have seen over the years that the Mayo Clinic does, where they have an annual media conference where they invite in reporters, in their case from around the world and around the nation, about changing patterns of science and medicine. We believe there's a new opportunity for some of these clinical advisory boards for OPOs to do a similar thing, where you, once a year, conduct a 2-hour conference or high-level summit about the media and the reporters from both print and electronic means to become better informed about issues and opportunities and trends in this arena. We've mentioned a number of times, but the reason we are continuing to shine a light on joint planning and strategy development with the governing body and the advisory body is because we still see a need to strengthen those interactions and relationships. On slide 22, we have commented again on the need for the advisory board to establish a culture that is really driven toward quantitative and data-driven elements. If you have a high proportion, as many of you do, have members that are clinicians, they want to deal with specific issues and questions that they can dig into and respond to, and also meaningfully look at the future of the science in their respective subspecialty areas or organ systems arenas. These represent a series of activities that are important. Obviously, staff support and education opportunities for the board chairs and committee chairs are an important element of this as well. We would like to provide an opportunity for questions and conversations with you. This webinar is, of course, designed to not only share some of the insights that are becoming evident around the country on effective ways to leverage the time and the talent of your advisory boards. We will be continuing the process throughout the year to examine in more depth new ideas and drill in more detail to some of the areas that you have already been requesting us to explore. Let's see if, Kate, do you have any general closing comments here before we throw it open for questions and interaction with the participants in this webinar?
No, not really, but not to confuse our listeners, but going back to slide 21, I think the second 2 bullets, or the last 2 bullets, are really the most critical. Using the advisory board as a resource for thinking about the future of the OPO and joint meeting of the governance board and advisory board. So in closing, I would just emphasize the focus in those two areas for advisory boards.
That makes sense, Kate. Thank you. And thank you all again for what you're doing and for your participation in this webinar. I'll turn back to our moderator to see if we do have a couple of questions that we could try to respond to.
Okay, great, Jim. Thank you. And we do indeed have a few questions that came in. Before I get started answering some of those, I want to go ahead and review, just as a reminder, and for any callers that might have joined our line a little bit late, how they can go ahead and submit those questions. Excuse me. So again, you simply want to type the questions that you have that you want to be read off for you on the Q&A button on the menu bar at the top of your screen. Hit submit after you type it in. That filters over to us, and we're able to read it and then answer the questions for you. That being said, I'll go ahead and start with the first question that I received from our audience, and that is, what are the best ways OPOs seem to be using to develop the capabilities of their clinical advisory board members?
All right, we did address a little bit of that in the webinar, but there's probably 2 or 3 important strategies that we're seeing across the country. First, it begins with the recruitment process itself. The concept in executive search and physician search firms is a concept called competency-based recruitment. As you look over the next 3 to 5 years at the clinical, the economic, the political, and the psychological challenges that are going to be facing the OPO movement and your local OPO, it would be useful to make sure that those are translated into the kinds of competencies that you are looking for, the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes, the background that you want serving on the board, in this case the clinical advisory board. Kate summarized the key patterns of backgrounds earlier in this webinar, but once you've defined the competencies and have recruited those people, the next key event is a structured orientation of those board members that should be conducted both by staff and board members. And increasingly, as you embrace the digital age, you'll have some streaming video available to assist in that board orientation as a way to build their capabilities. And then also, even though these clinical advisory boards are only meeting 3 or 4 or 5 times a year, it's probably prudent to build into each of those sessions some short comments that are of education in nature that might benefit from short presentations by board members themselves or occasionally an outside speaker. And the last comment I think I would make to this important question is that it's also useful for the individual board members themselves to identify knowledge areas they would like help to get smarter about. And in that regard, we've already seen some of these OPOs identify 10 or 12 common issues and hand that out to each board member at the beginning of the year, ask them to circle 2 or 3 topics they'd like more knowledge about, and then the staff can assemble some easy-to-read information to help them. So I think it's a good question, and those 3 or 4 strategies might be a good way to respond to the question.
Very good. Thank you, Jim. Moving on to another question we received, we have just been asking, you mentioned that OPO board and clinical advisory boards should do a joint strategic planning retreat. Can you describe that a bit more, please?
Well, Kate, I'll respond quickly, and then you can offer some comments as well. It's useful if these joint efforts look far into the future. Each OPO and advisory board has their own unique dynamics in your market, but the more that you can get these 2 bodies thinking strategically, in other words, a common device that we've started to use over the last few months is to get those folks thinking about the challenge of defining in the summer of the year 2020, how would you like your OPO to look and behave, and then get the group engaged in this strategic planning session or retreat to identify some of the practical obstacles that they're going to have to wrestle with or remove if they're to get from where they are today to that desired future state, that vision of them in the future. And then also, I would encourage these joint planning retreats to think of some interesting exercises that force them to think out of the box. What would be some strategic opportunities that might present themselves, perhaps joint ventures from biosciences organizations, or some unique ways to strengthen the working relationships with the transplant centers, and have small groups in a retreat setting identify some practical ways to enhance or to improve their effectiveness in dealing with some of those challenges. The last comment I think would be useful is the whole area of using the retreat as an opportunity for education, to bring in outside speakers to stimulate the thinking from these advisory board members about their role, their responsibilities, and how those are likely to change, not over the next few months, but over the next few years. So perhaps, Kate, you have some additional thoughts that you'd want to share or stimulate our thinking about on this area.
Sure. I think some of the activity at these joint meetings should also revolve around developing the strategies for the OPO going forward, and also establishing the goals for the organization, and then probably include a review of accomplishments and dashboards. And really all of these pieces that Jim mentioned and that I just mentioned now is really to get everyone on the same page, with a focus of everyone looking into the future in the same way, and being on board with the same initiatives and goals and strategies.
You reminded me of another important point, Kate, and that is that I know that many of the OPOs are very much staff-driven. They develop the strategies, they identify the complexities and the challenges coming down the road, understandably, because they are the full-time professionals in this regard. But the more the staff can invite and engage their board members, the more vital, I think, the relationships and the stronger the plans are going to be. You also mentioned, Kate, a very important point, which is developing strategies. The budget, of course, is a plan of how scarce resources are going to be used. We've started to get requests from some of the OPOs to help them think about how to design a philanthropy strategy. Most of the 58 OPOs are all multi-million-dollar organizations. They have never been very focused or, frankly, very effective in inviting philanthropy to undergird and to support some of their community awareness and public education initiatives. I think that's another area of topic that the joint planning could find some meaningful dialogues about what is our philanthropy strategy and how can we make that even more effective to make sure that our financial vitality is strong going forward.
Okay, thank you both for your responses to that question. We're looking at the clock here. It looks like we have just a little bit more time. I'm going to go ahead and take one more question from our audience, and then we'll wrap up our presentation. So our final question for the afternoon is, how are OPO advisory boards organizing their work in selected committees?
Jim, I'll start with this one and then pass it to you maybe. We're seeing organizations organize in a couple different ways. Some of them have created their advisory committee with then, as I've alluded to in the past or mentioned in the past already, subcommittees or committees focusing, one, on public awareness. And this is a point we've mentioned it's increasingly important for organizations to be dealing with. And the second one then is a committee revolved around the medical or clinical issues. But then we also have some organizations who approach their structure a little differently, and they are creating 3 to 4 or 5 committees, and these committees are focused specifically around medical issues, and then their advisory committee still deals with the public awareness. So these 3, 4, 5 committees that they've established are your kidney, pancreas committees, critical care, liver, heart, procurement, preservation type committees. And then they all report up to the advisory board or bring their information back to the advisory board. And then in turn, the advisory board is sort of rubber stamping. Well, not, they're approving the research that was done by these subcommittees or committees, and then pushing that information up further to the governing board and providing them with the ultimate information that they really need to govern the organization. Jim, do you have additional
I think that makes good sense. I think maybe a closing comment on the role of the advisory board in total is they get this input from the working groups or the subcommittees. I hope all of them will keep that strategic focus, that their role, their effectiveness to guide the work of the fiduciary board that oversees and governs the OPO is to really help think about where is the science and the economics of transplantation going, both for organs and for tissues, and to really be a catalyst for strategic thinking and therefore strategic planning coming up from the committees and for the board as a whole. I think we should perhaps wrap this webinar up now on that point, think strategically and act as focused as possible within these advisory boards, and then the true promise that perhaps was envisioned by the CMS in encouraging everyone to form them can more likely be achieved. Thank you again, everyone, for participating.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to our participants who submitted questions, and also to Jim and Kate for their responses. On your screen, you've seen that we've had contact information for our speakers. If you have further questions or you'd like to call and have a discussion with them, you can give them an email or give them a call on our toll-free 800 number we have listed there. A recording of this webinar, and as we mentioned, a copy of the report of the survey summary will be emailed to each of our participants. In addition, you can get a copy of the slides plus that report will be emailed to participants. A recording of this webinar plus other resources like articles, white papers, presentations can be found on our website. Just go to ihstrategies.com and go to our Knowledge Center. And to see a listing of any upcoming events we have going on from our firm, you can visit the events page on our website. Thanks again for joining us.